Okay, folks, well, good afternoon and welcome to another one of our TESS seminars. As you know, TESS is our Center for Tropical, Environmental, and Sustainability Science here at JCU. We've been running now for quite a while. 14 years TESS has been going. And yeah, we really enjoy it. One of the things that's really happened has been much more of a shift towards people watching online, but we're still getting pretty good audiences every week. Our biggest so far this semester is about 150 for, yeah, big thing. But anyway, for a talk like this one, a paleontological talk, I think this is probably a pretty good audience we've got, especially because we have a lot of folks following remotely. It's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Suzanne. Sue is one of Australia's preeminent paleontologists, focusing especially on mammals, especially on bats. Really important groups here in Australia. She's worked a lot on the evolution and diversification of the biota and the mammalian fauna here in Australia over a period of 100 million years altogether. So she's really spanned a great deal of time. Her work's really diverse and impactful. She's had more than 200 scientific papers. She spent most of her career at the University of New South Wales, of course, which is one of the big eight, very fine universities here in Australia. And she's just, we're really interested in hearing what she's going to tell us about Riversleigh and also about the evolution of Australia's mammalian fauna. Thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And yeah, what I hope to do in this seminar is tell you a little bit about Riversleigh, a bit of background information, and then I'll launch into the bat side of things. So let's get started. So to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Riversleigh region of northwest Queensland, the Waanyi Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So the Riversleigh World Heritage Area is part of a serial site, a World Heritage Site, known as the Australian Fossil Mammal Sites. And this is one of about 20 of Australia's World Heritage Places. So Riversleigh is up in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and the other part of the site, of the Australian Mammal Site, is in Narracourt Caves in South Australia, which is about 2,000 kilometres south. So both of them together represent the Australian fossil mammal sites. The Riversleigh section of the Australian fossil mammal sites is in Boodjamulla National Park in the Gulf, and it's in the southern section of the park, and it covers an area of about 10,000 square kilometres of the park. The only publicly accessible part of the actual site is D site, which shown over here. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, which is quite close to the road that runs up towards Lawn Hill. The site was inscribed on the World Heritage List for its globally significant rich fossil record that provides a picture of the key stages of the evolution of Australia's mammals, including their response to climate change. Here are some photos from D site, and as I said, this is the only publicly accessible part of the park, of the actual site within the park. And there's an interpretive centre or centre at the site, and here is a picture of the Boodjamulla dance culture group celebrating the 25th anniversary of the listing of the World Heritage listing of the Riversleigh section, or the Australian Fossil Mammal Site, and that was in 2019. So this year is another big year because it's the 30th anniversary of the World Heritage listing of the site. So what is it about Riversleigh that makes it special? Obviously, it includes its fine fossils. The site has produced, or the Riversleigh section has produced about 350 new fossil species, and this includes of vertebrates and invertebrates, and this includes everything like fish, frogs, reptiles, birds, and of course mammals, for which the site is listed. It's also been the subject of about 60 PhD and honours theses and over 400 scientific publications. So, and this has been based on the fossils, the rocks, and the paleoecology of this region. So it's a pretty significant site, and I think that everyone would agree we really only have scratched the surface. So within the park, so on the right-hand side here is a map of the Cenozoic limestone that contains most of the fossils. And these range in age, these limestone deposits range in age from about 25 million years ago to the present. And there are other significant part of Cenozoic limestone bluffs outside the World Heritage list, outside the World Heritage site, but within the site are two very significant plateaus, including the D plateau here, which includes the right at the edge of that is where D site is, and also the Gag plateau. So in these areas or on these limestone bluffs, we've identified about 300 to 350 different sites that have produced vertebrate fossils. So again, a very significant number of sites within the park. So in this slide here that I'm showing here, this is what we call a biocorrelation slide or chart. And what it shows here are the Riversleigh deposits. This is time up here. So this is from about 100 million years ago to the present. And these are the states across here. And we can see that within Queensland, the number of Riversleigh sites, which I've put a block around here, are very significant. They range in age, as I mentioned before, from about 25 million right up to the present. And this is a picture of these sites here have been, they represent a sequence of sites, and they've been radiometrically dated, or they're biocorrelated by the stage of evolution of the mammals they contain. And this is a photo here of John Woodhead, who has been instrumental in producing the radiometric dates of the Riversleigh deposits. And here he's removing or taking a sample of some flowstone here, which he's been able to use to date the deposits. So the Riversleigh World Heritage Area is on the leading edge of Australia as it approached Southeast Asia on its journey from about 25 million years ago to the present. So in the past, at about 25 million years ago, Riversleigh was actually much further south at 30 degrees south and about the latitude of Armidale today in New South Wales. Today, of course, it's at about 19 degrees south, so much closer to the tropics. And this is reflected in the changing environment. So we see two influences on the environments that we see at Riversleigh over time. So at about 25 million years ago, we think we're sampling cool, temperate type forests, perhaps more open than subsequently. Then in the Miocene in the early Miocene and middle Miocene, we appear to be sampling much more closed forests, greenhouse conditions in those sites. And then later in the sequence, what we're seeing is a decline in both rainfall and possibly temperature, although that's not clear. And so we're sampling more savanna and semi-arid types of environments in those Riversleigh deposits. One of the things about the Riversleigh region is the spring-fed waterways. So that today, the Riversleigh area is a semi-arid savanna type region, but it's the spring-fed rivers and creeks that run through the area that are the lifeblood to the area. And it's these same waters which are supercharged with calcium carbonate or dissolved limestone that are appear to have facilitated the fossilization of the Riversleigh fossils. And down here we've got these are tufa dams that are building up over time. I think this is Lawn Hill Creek here. And most of the fossil deposits that we are looking at Riversleigh represent either lake deposits, tufa deposits such as this, cave deposits and fissure field deposits. And what we often see in the fossils and in the limestone is that we get this halo of calcite around things like, well, in this case, it's a fossil possum skull. That it has a halo of calcite that appears to have been basically a protective halo around these as they're fossilized. So in the Riversleigh World Heritage Area, we see different sorts of deposits, as I've just mentioned. Sometimes the beds can be quite thick, and this is an example where the sediments are quite thick. The limestone sediments are quite thick in this is AL90. And what happens here is that the blocks of limestone are mechanically quarried. This is using drill and crowbar, and they're taken from the site and in blocks, large blocks, often by use of a helicopter or four-wheel drive vehicles, and then taken back to the acid prep lab, in this case UNSW, and here's Anna Gillespie working her magic. So the blocks of limestone are brought back to the lab, and they are chemically processed using weak acetic acid that miraculously leaves the Riversleigh fossils virtually intact. Possibly this is because they're slightly silicified. So what happens is the limestone is dissolved and the fossils come out beautifully intact. And in this case, this is a small thylacine recovered from AL90 site with a reconstruction of an ancient thylacine here. And here we can see that the cranium, so the skull, and most of the skeleton is also preserved. And that's typical of this AL90 site, which is one of Riversleigh's probably most famous sites. And here are some other examples why. So this is another view of AL90 site. And what AL90 appears to represent is an old fossil cave, and we'll talk about caves shortly. But here is a block of the fossil limestone that's come out of AL90, and also not a reconstruction. This is a skeleton of Nimodon, which is one of probably the most famous Riversleigh animals that have come from the site. And in this case, Nimodon was a 70 kilo marsupial, about a sheep-sized animal that is incredibly well represented in AL90. And what we have found at AL90, and a lot of this represents the work by Karen Black, is that there is at least 26 individuals, I think it is to date, that have been recovered from that site. And these range from, small suckling pouch young right up to mature adults. So a beautiful ontogenetic series represented in the site with amazing material and so well represented. I should say that this is, in this case, the fossils are associated. So that is that skulls and skeletons are, in association and can be reconstructed as single individuals. In many other Riversleigh sites, however, the association is not as clear. However, in this site, it is miraculous. It's fantastic. So the sorts of information that come from fossils like Nimbledon is quite extraordinary. What we know about Nimbledon is that phylogenetically, or its closest relatives are wombats and koalas, but this was a very different looking animal. So here it is reconstructed in the treetops, because by looking at its skeleton, what we can see is extreme specializations of the hands and feet, that with opposable thumbs and toes, and gigantic claws on these on the hands and feet. As you can see here, here's one with reconstructed with a sheath on a claw sheath on it, that indicates that that Nimbledon was not only a tree hugger, but it also might have been it may have hung upside down, or a tree hanger, I should say, because it might have hung upside down from trees at that time. Now, the age of AL90 is about 15 million years ago, so we're talking about quite old beasts. But the preservation is such that there have been other things that we have been able to determine about Nimbledon and its life history. For example, we have been able to look at the tooth wear, so fine scratches on the teeth of these individuals that indicate that this was probably an animal, a marsupial that ate fruit, unlike obviously koalas and wombats today. And in many ways, the scratches actually looked very, very similar to those wear patterns that you see in tapirs today. And the other amazing thing about this animal is that there's been an opportunity to actually study the cross sections of some of the limb bones, which and the microstructure of the bone, that can give us a lot of information about how long these animals might have lived and how they developed. And in the case of Nimbledon, what we can see are that in some of these limb bones, for example, this is the femur, that there are indications of spurts of growth. And these are probably annual spurts of growth. And there are at least 8 of them in this particular bone that suggest that this animal lived till, was developing until it was 8 years old. So that it might have been 8 years old before it reached sexual maturity. And that's quite impressive for a marsupial. For example, a large kangaroo may have become sexually mature at about 2 years of age. So this is quite a different animal. We're getting lots of information from these deposits that we would never have imagined without them. And there's what we can see again and again, that new techniques can be applied to some of these ancient fossils that are giving us incredibly rich information about the animals that lived in these forests. So, and Riversleigh, of course, the fossils are not only about mammals. So there are many non-mammals that are also providing really significant information that are incredibly well preserved. For example, here is one of the tiny dwarf crocodiles, if you like, from Riversleigh. This gives you an idea. This is a skull, and this is the size of this animal. This is an adult sitting in the palm of someone's hand here, and a reconstruction of what these animals might have looked like. So some really bizarre little guys that are extinct today, but once roamed these forests. And also, and on the other hand, on the flip side of that, I guess, is giant snakes that were a bit anaconda-like, that belong to an ancient group, an extinct group, totally extinct group of Matsoid snakes that were found right across Gondwana. So again, beautiful material, telling all sorts of stories and information about the fauna that lived in these forests. And just another example, I guess, of the way that new techniques can be applied to these old fossils to provide new information. And in this case, we're looking at one of these small crocodiles, Mikasuking crocodile from Riversleigh. And in this case, finite element analysis, which is a technique that engineers typically use. And in this case, they've been applied to some of the limb bones of Riversleigh crocodiles, and the forces associated with swimming and or walking are simulated in these analyses to try and determine what the habitat and what the lifestyle of these little crocs might have been. So far, there is evidence that, in fact, some of these smaller crocs were probably more terrestrial than living Australian crocodiles, which are semi-aquatic, and they might have even been arboreal. So lots of information coming from these sites. And I can't stop with the background to Riversleigh without mentioning some amazing fossilized insects and plants that are coming out of these deposits. So we're getting macrofossils of plants, for example, these leaves, and also whole insects, millipedes, and so on. But also fruit, rainforest fruits are also being preserved, and things down like pollen, butterfly wings, and so on. So lots of information coming out of these Riversleigh deposits. So bats, it brings me to bats. So why bats? Why are we studying Riversleigh bats? So bats are a really significant component of modern mammal faunas. So today there are over 1,460, so 1,460 living species. That represents about 21% of world mammals, so a big chunk. And they have a global distribution, except for Antarctica. But I think they're there, or they were there. And they have critical roles in all ecosystems globally as insect predators, seed dispersers, pollinators, in terrestrial ecosystems. In Australia, we have about 80 modern species, and this represents a higher percentage of our native land mammal fauna, about 25%, and actually in the tropics probably higher, closer to 30%. So again, I repeat, this is a significant proportion of Australia's modern mammal fauna. It's also been recognised in recent years that they are bellwethers. They appear to be very sensitive to climate change, and they represent bellwether species for anthropogenic rapid climate change. So again, we'll come back to that because that's an important part of this. The Riversleigh World Heritage Area, a lot of it is freshwater limestone karst. So this means that there are a lot of caves and fissures that develop in the limestone country. So here we have a picture here that is represents an aerial photo that shows some of these limestone outcrops. Here we have a modern cave at Riversleigh with a developing cave. And also what we also have are unroofed caves. So these are, if you like, fossilized caves. So these are caves where the roof and some of the walls are missing, but the floor remains. And there are many, many, many of these fossilized caves in the Riversleigh World Heritage Area. So here is a picture of what we're looking at here is a slab of the old cave floor at one of a site that's about 17 million years old, and a close-up of what that floor looks like. Now, all of these things represent bat fossils, and this includes a jaw and some cross sections through very fine limb bones that we see in these bats. And here we've got a block of Riversleigh limestone that's been partially processed with acetic acid, which just shows this is a skull, another skull here, another skull here, another skull here, another skull here, and a lot of the limb bones that are bristling from this, this block of Riversleigh limestone. This is a diagrammatic representation of cave development at Riversleigh and the fossil sites. So what we're looking at is what the cave, a cross section through what the cave might have looked like in the forest, 17 million years ago, perhaps 15 million years ago. And this dotted line here represents what the surface of what we're looking at today. So this is what's exposed today at about this level, which cuts through various caves, some larger than others. And these just represent some of the geological samples that are associated with these kinds of cave deposits at Riversleigh. And again, here's that same block from AL90 showing here, which is would have come from the cave floor in this situation. What we also get associated with these caves are fossilized stalagmites here that John Woodhead has been able to use to date, radiometrically date many of these cave deposits, which has been a fantastic breakthrough since about 2016. And here this is actually the skull of a kangaroo. This is a tooth row. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer. I hope you can. But anyway, there is, believe me, there is a row of teeth showing up here, as well as most of the skull, the nose towards the left. And this is encased in flowstone. In this case, it's about, I think it's about 14 million year old flowstone that encases this, this skull of this kangaroo. So bats, there's a lot of them from Riversleigh, many, many, many. These are all little tiny skulls from one site. So they are abundant in most deposits, and the other photo here again shows what you typically get in some Riversleigh sites, which is some Riversleigh cave sites. Not all of them, but some Riversleigh cave sites are particularly rich in bat fossils. When we look at how many of these bats there are, we recognise about 57 bat species. These have been identified in about 75 Riversleigh sites or local faunas. I should say that bats occur in most of the Riversleigh sites, so in about 300 different sites, but they haven't been tallied yet, so that's a big project ahead of us. In this particular case, this example I'm showing here, these are some of the Riversleigh sites across the top here, and some of the Riversleigh taxa down the side here, and this represents presence-absence site. The big task ahead of us will be to expand that to include abundance data, so that we can look at biomass and in many ways, this will be an extremely useful thing to do, but it's an enormous job. Also, I want to just show you here about the size of some of these bats. I mean, this is a matchstick, just a normal matchstick. And these are tiny, tiny little skulls. So they're incredibly well preserved for something so small and delicate. So what we know about the Riversleigh bat record is that when we pick up the record about 25 million years ago, most of the families of bats that are in Australia today had arrived. Most of them probably came from Southeast Asia and Africa, although some may also represent Gondwana groups. This is an example of a Riversleigh bat cave from 17 million years ago. This is a wider shot of the cave floor that we saw in an earlier image, and this is Bicentenary site, and this is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like 17 million years ago. In this particular site, there are about I think it's up to 10 or 11 bats that cohabited this cave 17 million years ago. This is an example of a younger cave, a cave from about 2 million years ago. This is Rackham's Roost site, and this samples a much younger bat community. And in this site, we get some of the modern bat species represented, as well as some ancient ones that we are no longer in the modern Australian fauna. This is again what Rackham's Roost looks like today, and a reconstruction of how it might have looked like 2 million years ago. So the Riversleigh bat faunas are dominated by certain groups of bats, and one of these, this group is called the trident bats. Up there in the left-hand corner is a map of the distribution of trident bats today, and it's pretty sparse. There's only about 9 species of this group remaining, and they are scattered mostly in Africa and also Australia. And in fact, Australia has today just a single species left, and that's its distribution from the Pilbara right up to about the Riversleigh area in Northern Australia. The trident bats are echolocating bats. They tend to be relatively small, maximum size of about maybe 13 grams. They emit their echolocation calls through their nose, and they have very complicated nose leaves. Most bats that we know in Australia today tend to have skull shapes that look like this, but this particular group are really buffy looking bats. They have buffy skulls, and this is a cross section here, or this photo here represents a cross section through one of these Riversleigh skulls that shows quite complicated structures within the nasal chambers that we don't see today in modern representatives of this group. And this appears to be related to either their echolocation call or the way they conserve moisture. And it's one of the areas that we're able to explore in these Riversleigh bat communities, because the preservation is so incredibly good. And what we're seeing are things that are just not necessarily there in modern groups. So lots of information from this group. It's the group that dominates the Riversleigh deposits, both in terms of abundance, but also diversity. So about 28 species of this group in the Riversleigh deposits. What we do know by doing phylogenetic analyses, and we're trying to understand where these bats came from and whether this is an endemic radiation or not. Up the top are 3 of the Riversleigh species. The ones in green relate to Australian deposits and Australian species. The ones in white are generally the African ones. What we understand about this group is that the group evolved probably in Africa about 41 million years ago, and that there were at least 2 dispersals to Australia from Africa that would explain the radiation here. Other groups of bats that are represented in the Riversleigh deposits are the ghost bats, carnivorous ghost bats, leaf-nosed bats, many of these, and sheep-tail bats. And again, these appear in the rocks from 25 million years ago to the present. They tend to be less abundant and less diverse, although I should say that with the ghost bats, we recognise about, I think we're up to 8 different species of this group. Also represented common-tailed, free-tailed, and New Zealand burrowing bats are also represented in the Riversleigh deposits, which is quite a turn up for the books. And they appear to have been relatively diverse in the past in Australia, but today they survive only in New Zealand. So from this work, we're gathering a picture of Riversleigh bats, and these are I guess, some of the best recognised of the groups in the Riversleigh deposits. And I should say that many of these bats have ecological and evolutionary counterparts in the wet tropics and the Gondwana Rainforests, World Heritage Area. So what we're seeing with what happens to these bats in the face of climate change has relevance for bats in the wet tropics and in Gondwana rainforests as well. There are 3 groups that are not in the Riversleigh deposits, which are quite interesting. We don't have horseshoe bats, bent-winged bats, or flying foxes and fruit bats. So this has always been a little bit of a puzzle. But as we understand more about their evolution and from molecular data in particular, we understand that these might be fairly recent arrivals to Australia. For example, this is Rhinolophus, the Rhinolophid group, which does occur in the wet tropics, does not occur at Riversleigh today or in the Riversleigh deposits. And we understand that this group may not have been in the Australian area until, the last, say, 5 to 10 million years. And we're just not picking these up in the fossil record, in the older fossil-rich record of Riversleigh. This is a graph that just shows what was happening in terms of changing climates in Northern Australia. And this is between 10 and 20 million years ago. And if we just maybe concentrate on this proxy here of climate change, we can see that there was a change, significant change during the Miocene. And this is a time when Riversleigh deposits are really well represented, radiometrically dated, and are in a perfect position to tell us a story about what happened to fauna over this period. And of course, I'm interested in bats. So what we can see is that Riversleigh bat families had mixed fortunes over time. Some groups did very well in that hot Miocene period and then have declined since. Others remained fairly stable, and still others increased in diversity after that period. And we see that for each of these, this is at the family level, but we also see this at the genus level and also at species levels as well. What we do know is the Vespertilionids, or these are the common bats, and these represented about nearly half of Australia's mammals today, and also in the wet tropics, they represent a very large group. And we can see that they did extremely well. This is the global record. And what it shows is that, and I think, where are we? The Vespertilionids are this group here, the blue group, and they just really exploded in diversity after the Miocene. They did extremely well. And we see 2 peaks, one globally and then one in Australia a little later. If we look at the life history attributes of these 2 groups, say, and we compare what happened to some of these leaf-nosed or the trident bats, which plummeted in diversity, and Vespertilionids that increased, some of the things that stand out is just the flexibility in all sorts of attributes that the vespertilionids have. So what we can see is that we see this in the roost temperature, in whether they go into daily torpor, seasonal torpor, what their energy stores are, what their water stores are, and even their echolocation and foraging modes. Vespertilionids have certainly the most successful group currently, and trident bats are some of the groups that have suffered over time. I just wanted to just mention something about bat ecomorphology, because it underpins what we're doing when we're looking at the Riversleigh record. So the Riversleigh bat record, and that is the combination of ecology and morphology, where we can look at morphological traits and from that explore what their behavior and ecology might be. And we see this and I'll just skim through this, that what we can study, its changes over time are things like we can look at diet, we can look at foraging ecology, because in bats, echolocation call and wing shape and phylogeny are highly correlated with foraging mode. So we can get all sorts of information from that aspect. We know that we can also look at cranial shape, and this can give us information, that skull shape, and that can also give us information about the echolocation call type, and also information about their diet again. And we also can look at the bone microstructure, and this can tell us about, for example, foraging mode. In this case, the strength of the hind limbs in bats that burrow. For the first time, we've been able to use new methods to calculate precisely echolocation call in a fossil bat, and we did this last year in a 50 million year old fossil bat from Europe. And this has opened up all sorts of possibility for the Riversleigh bats. In this case, we took fine measurements of the inner ear of the fossil bat, and we were able to calculate the length of the basilar membrane, which occurs in the cochlea. And from this, we were able to determine its echolocation mode and also its call frequency. So we can apply this, and what we're doing at the moment is applying this to the Riversleigh bats. So here's one of our beautiful Riversleigh our fossils from bicentenary site, and the petrosals are beautifully preserved. We're able to work out the length of the basilar membrane, and using it and a whole lot of other information we're putting together, we can actually look at the echolocation call in Riversleigh bats for the first time. So this is a real breakthrough, I think, in these sorts of studies. And this allows us to look at echolocation calls in Riversleigh bats across time and habitat. We can look at this, for example, in a couple of lineages that stand out to me, and that are the carnivorous ghost bats, which are quite prevalent in the Riversleigh deposits, and we can see them changing in size and call over time. And yet, interestingly, in some of the trident bats, we don't see that, and it looks as though they are remaining stable in their attributes. So we can look at this at individual lineages, and I think more importantly, we can look at it at community structure and see how communities might be changing over time in terms, considering that echolocation call is tightly correlated with foraging and feeding. We also see extraordinarily soft tissue preservation in some of the Riversleigh deposits, in some of the cave deposits. And again, we return to bicentenary site. And here what we found is that there are ostracods that lived in pools of water in the cave 17 million years ago. that are incredibly well preserved, so much so that the sperm cells within the ostracods are preserved, and the structures within the sperm cells that contain the DNA are also extremely well preserved. And our understanding about this is that what has facilitated this is the constant stream of guano from the many bats in the deposit that has helped preserve these structures. We also have found ghost bat coprolites. So these are fossil poos from a 2 million year old site at Riversleigh, at Rackham's Roost. And in these pellets, when we have looked at, not only are there broken bits of the prey of ghost bats, but they're also hairs. And the next stage of this project is to look at whether there might be biological or biomarkers or biological material still contained in these 2 million year old scats. And I just wanted to finish, I guess, here with something else also related to ghost bat guano, and that is the incredible opportunity, actually, to look at paleo-environmental information from huge ghost bat guano piles, just like tree rings and sediment cores and ice cores and so on. Guano bat cores can give a lot of paleo-environmental information. And in this case, we're hoping to retrieve information about ghost bat diet, which includes insects and vertebrates, but also changing climates, perhaps over what we think represents hundreds, if not thousands of years of in a time capsule made of ghost bat guano. So just in summary, we are seeing different responses by different bat lineages to past climate change in the Riversleigh deposits. And whilst extinction is an inevitable and important part of the evolution of bat lineages, the rate at which that change is happening now makes bats very vulnerable to climate change. And I think if there's a message from the work that we've been doing on these on Riversleigh bat faunas over time, is that the bat fauna is as vulnerable to climate change as any other group of animals. That management strategies for native fauna need to be explicit about conserving individual bat lineages, not just bats in general, but also their caves, their foraging grounds, tree hollows, and so on. And this might need to be explicit for each group. And that the study of bats, both extant and extinct, should be a critical element in all planning to conserve our native fauna in the face of this very rapid change that we're undergoing now. Oh, sorry. My acknowledgements, where am I? There we are, acknowledgements. And I wanted to thank a whole bunch of people here, just some of whom are listed, and all of the people who've been involved in the Riversleigh project for such a long time, and the custodians and managers of the World Heritage property. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, thank you, Sue. So are there any questions from our online folks? Or be thinking about questions. If you want to ask something, you can go ahead and pop in. I think Annabelle's able to track if there's any questions coming in. Anybody here in the in-person audience? Any questions? Yeah, Bob? Oh, sorry, I guess I could give you the microphone here. Otherwise, it doesn't end up on this. Hey.
Sue, thank you very much for that. The first question should not be a taphonomic question, but it is. I have this view that if most of these fossils, apart from the cave floor deposits, are in tufa or travertine, how on earth did they get preserved? I mean, I had this picture of an animal falling into a pool, but then to maintain the extraordinary preservation, the calcium carbonate deposition rate must have been incredibly fast. Yet the thickness of the deposits don't suggest that, so I'm puzzled.
Well, what I would say to that, I guess, is that there is, I guess there's a range of deposits represented. And so not just tufa, and in fact, tufa is actually quite a controversial question about in terms of how the fossils actually were preserved. But there is definitely a range of fossilization processes involved. One thing that we did at the beginning, I guess, of our when we started working on Riversleigh bats is that we had the opportunity to go to Borneo, to some of the huge caves there, to try and understand fossilization in rainforest in limestone. And what we found there was that if the remains of the bats or other animals fell into guano pile, they usually weren't preserved, and that but if they fell into the water, they appeared to have been preserved better. So we'd say that, which I know that, which is kind of interesting, because in the case of the ostracods, there they fell into water in the pool, and that seems to have made increase their the fossilization process there. What we do see is, in the Gregory River today, cattle bones that are, maybe, cow bones that are obviously, just out less than 100 years old, are completely coated with limestone, and they seem to, be preserving very well. So they'll be the future fossils. So I really can't, I think we have a lot to understand in terms of preservation processes at Riversleigh, and there may be many different ones.
Other questions? Penny does. Oh, Penny. Okay, go ahead, Penny.
Yeah, hi, Sue. It's really great to see you online here. I have a question about the dispersal of animals into Australia and out of Australia, I suppose. I mean, the songbirds we find now seem to have gone from Australia as soon as the Sula spur collided with Southeast Asia and went out through that part of the world, through Wallachia and all there. Are you saying that the bats also came in, perhaps when that began to happen in the early Miocene?
Hi, Penny. Look, what I think is interesting is by the time we pick up the record at 25 million, the bats were already here.
Already here. Mm.
Yeah, many of them were already here. And what is surprising, I think, also, there are a couple of anomalies. Of course, there always are. There are thousands of questions we can ask about this, but some of the really kind of archaic groups that we're seeing in Australia, including these old world trident bats, they don't occur in New Guinea, and which is a real anomaly, and neither do ghost bats, which again is just weird. So whether they came in before New Guinea was had risen to provide enough habitat to keep these endemic groups of bats going, I don't know, but I think the more phylogenetic studies that we're doing, the more we're finding that they may be coming from places like Africa rather than the nearest place like Southeast Asia. So, some bats travel 3,500 kilometers seasonally, regularly, and some catch boats down the coast of North America, which is another interesting thing. But yeah, so they were here, and certainly we have a bat record that goes back to 55 million years. Whether those bats also came in from the north or they were from South America, we still don't know. So a lot we don't yet fully understand.
Can I just ask one more question? I guess there's no other place on the planet like Riversleigh. I'm not talking about marsupials now. I'm just talking about the extent of fossils.
Certainly, I mean, I think that is definitely true about the bats. There is nowhere else that has a fossil bat record like that. We, you know, Australia is so fortunate to have this record. That you know, the eyes of the world are upon us, really, because we have a wonderful opportunity to look at you know, this particular record, and I think it will have a lot to say about what happened during past climate upheaval.
Thank you.
Jack? Okay, Jack, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Suzanne. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, and sorry if you already mentioned this, but just with the climate change in this area, of the change from rainforest to the savanna, do we know how rapid that was when it happened?
There is information from all sites, I think, across Australia about what happened after the Middle Miocene, so in the later Miocene. We know that there was basically a steady decline in not so much temperature. Temperatures a complicated one, but certainly in terms of precipitation, there was a you know, more or less a steady decline since the later Miocene, although there were peaks of wetness, and this is one of the things that that is recognised globally. But it's also interesting, I think, that in Narracourt, our sister site, if you like, they've done some remarkable work recently that shows that that even in the Pleistocene, you know, Australia really wasn't as dry as we might think. So I think that was really like a steady decline in terms of, you know, going from the opening of the rainforests in Australia.
Okay. Hugo, do you have a question? Is there Hugo? I guess not. Sue, anybody else here? Okay, Sue, my question really kind of echoes the previous questions, but I was just stunned, not struck, stunned by the incredible fine detail of the fossils. And you mentioned some tissue preservation as well. And I guess the question Penny, I guess, asked is how unique is Riversleigh? But is it really a one-off on the planet Earth? And were there some kind of special conditions there that just allowed it to produce this amazing you know, fauna of these very fine-boned creatures?
Yeah, look, it is remarkable. There is no doubt about that. I think one of the most remarkable things about Riversleigh is the period of time that is represented in those deposits. So 25 million years in one place is quite extraordinary. There are, I guess, increasingly, we are seeing around the world really remarkable preservation of fossils, and these is popping up in different places. We see this in Quersy, where in France, where you get mummified frogs, for example, that are 50 million years old. We're also seeing you know, biomolecules being found in fossils that are millions of years old. So I think there are a couple of things have happened. Not only you know, is the material from Riversleigh remarkable, but I think new techniques like, you know, micro CT and also, you know, checking for you know, biological materials and so on. These are new things that have come into the field that I think will really shake up paleontology. I think it's an incredibly exciting time, and I think the questions that you can ask and maybe the things you see are just limited by, you know, by your imagination, by the questions you ask.
All right, well, that's a good way to end. Oh, sorry, do we have one more? Sorry, Sue, you're popular. So who's the question from? Oh, well, okay. Oh, so sorry, here's a question I'm going to read to you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for this very interesting presentation. Bats colonized Australia 25 million years ago to the late Oligocene, early Miocene, seems corresponding with the drift of Australia towards Asia. As suggested in the presentation, bats might have come from Asia or Africa during this time. However, why didn't the Wallace's line really act as a barrier to Asian or African species moving east for bats? Yeah.
A couple of things. So modern bats had arrived by 25 million years ago, but I should stress that bats were in Australia at 55 million years ago. So we have a site in Mergen in southeast Queensland that has produced one of the world's oldest fossil bats, which is a real turn up for the book. So that's 55 million year old bat. So that makes it so bats and marsupials were neck and neck at that stage. They're the same age, the oldest marsupials and the oldest bats in Australia. Unfortunately, we have this dark age. We have this period in the fossil record from 55 million years to 25 million years, and this is for all terrestrial mammals, where we don't have a record. So by the time we pick up the record again, we're seeing all these modern groups of bats, modern families of bats had already arrived in Australia. So where did they come from? Phylogenetically, we're finding, some of them have their closest relatives in Asia. Some of them have their closest relatives in Africa. Some of them have their closest, and these are living relatives, I should say, in New Zealand. So we really need to find out something about that record. But I think we can work backwards from a 25 million year old record to try and, tease apart some of those arrivals, and with molecular data involved as well, to find out. In terms of Australia does appear to not just receive bats, but also spread them to the rest of the world. For example, Mr. Sennett's, the burrowing bats, those amazing bats that only survive in New Zealand today, they may well have come from, New Zealand's bats might have come from Australia. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that Australia has possibly given back as well as received during, over the last 55 million years.
Okay, great, Sue. One last question. I have visited who's that from? From Hugo. I have visited Lawn Hill, and during my time there, I noticed the fauna over there was pretty unique. As described in the presentation, Riversleigh was a semi-arid environment where life was concentrated around water streams. So is Lawn Hill nowadays. Is there any study that have compared fossilized flora and the current living flora in the Lawn Hill area? If yes, is there any match between species?
I would say that there's been little work, systematic work done on the Riversleigh fossil plants so far. I think we're still, these are much rarer fossils than what we're seeing with vertebrate fossils. They appear to be preserving under different sorts of conditions, maybe acidic conditions rather than alkaline conditions. So I guess the short answer is the work has begun. Andrew Roosevelt from, for example, from the Queensland Museum has done some work on some of the Riversleigh fossil plants. And so I would say we're beginning, but there's a lot left to do. So I guess the answer is not really, no.
Well, it sounds like there's lots of work left to do, which of course is why the world's so interesting. So, Sue, thank you so much. We really appreciate you giving us your time and knowledge and experience. It's been a really interesting talk, and I think I'm a lot more interested in Riversleigh now than I probably was before. So it sounds like an amazing place. Yeah. Oh. Thank you, Sue. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.